I'm going to start speaking just as we start recording. Okay, so welcome folks. This is HUL256, lecture number 20, a makeup class the day after Holi, which maybe wasn't a sensible thing to, sensible choice of day, because maybe people are recovering from their Holi celebrations. But anyway, so now, as promised, we are moving on to the final stage of the course, reasoning with data. And I think maybe in retrospect, I should have reduced the science section and spent an extra week on this material. And what we're going to do is look at really two kinds of readings, two books. One which is we'll look at in the lectures, is a book called Calling Bullshit, which some of you may have already seen. And the other is, and so that's the book, that's the text we'll be using for the lectures. And in the 2 weeks of tutorials that we have left, we will look at a book that I think many of you would have heard of. Certainly Aditya, if I recall, has come across it, and that's Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. So the point about calling bullshit is a kind of general guide to critical thinking in the domain of data analysis, data presentation. And Thinking Fast and Slow is not directly a guide to critical thinking, but it talks about the ways our mind works, and ways, especially in thinking statistically or probabilistically, ways in which we often go wrong in certain systematic kinds of ways. And I've spoken before of this literature on heuristics and biases, which is something that Kahneman really created or co-created with his longtime collaborator Amos Tversky. So we've spoken a bit about that before, and if you recall in that Azim Premji reader, they talked at one point about fast thinking versus slow thinking. So this comes up in that domain as well. So this is what we'll be looking at, but we could spend a whole, it's kind of frustrating. I feel like every time I teach stuff, we could spend a whole semester just on teaching that thing, and instead we have to do these jhalaks of different kinds of things. So here's something, maybe we'll start. I'm going to stop sharing this and just share the website for the book, Calling Bullshit. That's the website. And why don't I actually have somebody read this out from the top? The world is awash in bullshit. Hello.
No. No. Can I read?
Yeah. Yes, please.
So, the world is awash in bullshit. Politicians are unconstrained by facts. Science is conducted by press release. Higher education rewards bullshit over analytic thought. Startup culture elevates bullshit to high art. Advertisers wing conspirationally and invite us to join them in seeing through all the bullshit and take advantage of our lower guard to bombard us with bullshit of the second order. The majority of administrative activity, whether in private business or public sphere, seems to be little more than a sophisticated exercise in the combinatorial uh, reassembly of bullshit. We are sick of it. It's time to do something, and as educators, one, one constructive thing we know how to do is to teach people. So the aim of this course is to help students navigate the bullshit-rich modern environment by identifying bullshit, seeing through it, and combining it with effective analysis and argument. What do we mean exactly by bullshit and calling bullshit? As a first approximation, bullshit involves language, statistical figures, data graphics, and other forms of representation intended to persuade by impressing and overwhelming a reader or listener with a blatant disregard for truth and logical coherence. Calling bullshit is a performative utterance, a speech act in which one publicly repudiates something objectionable. The scope of targets is broader than bullshit alone. You can call bullshit on bullshit, but you can also call bullshit on lies, treachery, trickery, and injustice.
Okay, so let's just pause there. So there are two important ways in which, this is a nice manifesto of what their concerns are. There are two important ways in which their concerns are different from some of the concerns we've looked at in the course so far. Any thoughts on what those differences are? I'm talking most specifically in terms of this definition of bullshit. So one difference, and it's not a complete difference, is that their focus is on forms of presentation. And we've seen a focus in forms of presentation, let's say in the use of language, but our concern in critical thinking more generally, as we've seen it in the course, goes beyond seeing through presentation, that is seen through like wrongful presentation, but also actually how to think about the world, or good ways of engaging with it. So that's one difference from what we've been doing. And another difference is that in their terms, bullshit involves a blatant disregard for truth and logical coherence. Whereas if you look at really, both the material in the first half of the course and things like propaganda, and even the material in the second half of the course on relating to things like superstition, there was some thought that the people doing this are kind of out to get you, right? And your critical thinking skills are a form of self-defense against sort of people who actively want you to believe false things for their own benefit or whatever. And here it's a little bit looser than that. The people doing the bullshitting need not like have a particular malign kind of desire that you come to believe something wrong, but they may just not care. That may be a bad thing as well. I mean, they certainly think it is, but it is different. And you'll see through the book often their greatest criticisms are for people like journalists who make claims about data and research findings where they may not really have a stake themselves in convincing readers that something is, obviously something that's false is true. They're not interested in lying or, being evasive, but their interest is in like, getting hits in their website, let's say, And so, that interest is kind of independent of the truth or rationality of what is on offer. So if you're focused on, if that's your metric or that's your goal, you may end up being indifferent to the truth, or have a blatant disregard for the truth, and then you're in the domain of what Bergstrom and West call bullshit. And actually, this term bullshit, it may seem odd, but this term bullshit is obviously a common term. It's kind of become popular in, I would say, the last 15 years or so, largely through an essay by a philosopher, in fact, somebody whom I knew at one point, Harry Frankfurt. He has an essay called On Bullshit, which became very popular, and that's what the title of this book is piggybacking on. You'll find 1,000 versions of this essay online. So in the chapter, and I'm going to stop sharing the website, though I'd invite you to take a look at it. It's a fun website. You can see the chapterization on the left of your screen. And my aim is to look at chapter 4 and 5, and if we get a chance, maybe either 10 or 11 in the next couple of weeks. So what we'll do is look today at the chapter on causality, and the main takeaway or the take home in this chapter is a kind of slogan that many of you will be that correlation doesn't imply causation. Though in fact they say that the more accurate term that they would like to use is association doesn't imply Do you know why they choose the term association as opposed to correlation? What's the difference for them between association and correlation? Or any guesses? Nope. Now in this text, unfortunately, the footnotes don't have but the footnotes are linked. So the reason they do this, they say we sometimes refer to association as correlations. The difference between association and a correlation is that a linear correlation requires numerical values, right? You can graph them, whereas associations can occur between categorical values, such as favorite color and favorite ice cream flavor. So strictly speaking, we should speak of associations rather than correlations, because the phenomenon that they're interested in is the phenomena of the extent to which an association between two different things, like the first example they give is having been kissed and having high self-esteem. That's not a numerical, those are not numerical terms. So you wouldn't be able to plot it on a graph, but it's still the kind of thing that you would be interested in knowing. Now, many of you I noticed in the in your short answer question, the last one, which is on Bihar, and remember that thing about um, uh, banning alcohol is the cause for the growth in um, Bihar's prosperity or development or whatever. Many of you correctly pointed out that it's an invalid argument because it's possible that this growth was caused by something else other than the alcohol ban. Right? It could be the government is independently doing other things that have led to excuse me, led to this prosperity. Just happened to be at the same time as the alcohol ban. Now let me ask you this. Is that a proper use of this slogan, or is it a proper instance of the slogan correlation doesn't imply causation? Or association doesn't imply causation? I was thinking that maybe not, right? Because there are no two variables that are being associated or correlated. The point that's being made is a similar point, but it's not a point about correlation per se. It's an example of a fallacy known as post hoc ergo propter. A fancy way of saying because one thing comes after the other, that thing caused the first thing. Anyway, so the structure of the chapter is to give a range of examples in which some association is shown empirically. Somebody does this study, and three things happen. One of three things happens. Either the researchers themselves are making some kind of explicit causal claim, which is not in fact supported by the evidence that they present, not supported by the evidence of simply the association, even if the association is very tight. So either that happens, or what happens is the researchers themselves are not making an explicit causal claim, and sometimes they're careful to say, we don't know what causes what in this association. Excuse me. But the way they present their findings makes it easy to see, or makes it may lead people to assume that there's some causality, even when none is intended. And the third kind of scenario they're interested in is when research, technical academic research, is picked up by journalists or the web and so forth, and they add a bit of masala. So the original study may have nothing, may make no causal claims, or it may caution you to realize or remember that the evidence doesn't support any causal claims. But when this is sort of filtered to the broader world, then those sorts of cautions are dropped, and what the world is told, or by a newspaper or a blog or whatever about the result is some kind of causal claim. So those are the three kinds of scenarios that they have in mind, and I'll just point you to a couple of places where they talk about this. I need to find page 56, but this doesn't have page numbers. How interesting is that? I will have to pull out my soft copy. Because I've looked at page numbers through the soft copies. Let's see. Page 56. Okay, so it's in the section of contemplating causation. That's 25 pages. Okay, so why don't we have somebody read from the second paragraph onwards, but it is rarely straightforward. So Jeet is already read. We can ask somebody else. Okay, Karthik, go for it.
But it is rarely straightforward to figure out what effects an action will have. A large fraction of the time, all we have to work with is information about correlations. Scientists have a number of techniques for measuring correlation and drawing inferences about causality from these correlations, but doing so is a tricky and sometimes contentious business, and these techniques are not always used as carefully as they ought to be. Moreover, when we read about recent studies in medicine or policy or any other area, these subtleties are often lost. It is a truism that correlation does not imply causation. Do not speak carelessly from data showing the former to assumptions about a letter.
Just pause for a second.
Continue?
Just pause for 1 second. How many of you have taken an economics classes at IIT? I know Karthikeya has. Anyone else? So does this lesson come up in your economics classes? Or this point?
I had an intro level course in economics when I did it.
And was this point made there?
No.
So the intro level would be more microeconomics,
yeah,
theoretical stuff, right? Presumably.
Yeah.
So this kind of, very careful work that economists have to do, or people in policy really have to do all the time, right? You have to, you want to understand. I mean, just think back to that Bihar example, right? Should we ban alcohol? Will a ban on alcohol reduce domestic abuse? Policymakers have to think in causal terms all the time, and they need to look at evidence of what causes what all the time. So social scientists, and particularly social scientists, psychologists, develop a whole range of essentially mathematical or statistical tools to think about these issues and to think methodologically about how one should make causal claims based on the kind of data that is available for us. And these guys talk about it a little bit in their book, but it's quite a it's quite a technical, sophisticated sort of enterprise. And the subject, you would, if I don't know if IIT has a undergraduate econometrics class, but that's the subfield of economics which is engaged with this kind of question. Okay, carry on, Karthikeya.
This is difficult to avoid because people use data to tell stories. The stories that draw us in a show a clear connection between cause and effect. Unfortunately, one of the most frequent misuses of data, particularly in the popular press, is to suggest a cause and effect relationship based on correlation alone. This is classic bullshit. In the vein of our earlier definition, because often the reporters and editors responsible for stories don't care what you end up believing. When they tell you drinking wine prevents heart disease, they are not leading you into alcoholism or away from behaviors that promote cardiac health. At best, they're trying to tell a good story. At worst, they're trying to compel you to buy a magazine or click on a link.
Just pause there. So that's the point I was making just now, right? That these guys may not be actively have any interest in misleading you. It's their indifference to the truth, and their incentives don't align with that of producing the truth. That's the issue. Okay, so carry on.
One team of researchers recently attempted to figure out how common this type of misinterpretation is in news stories and on social media. They identified the 50 research studies shared most often on Facebook and Twitter about how factors such as diet, pollution, exercise, and medical treatment were correlated with health or illness. Because it is very difficult to demonstrate causality in a medical study, only 15 to 50 studies. Yeah. Only 15 of the 50 studies did a decent job of demonstrating cause and effect relationships. Of these, only 2 met the highest standards for doing so. The rest identified only correlations.
So just to pause there, right? So this is the actual research. 1/3 of the actual research, I guess, actually demonstrated cause and effect relationships. The rest identified only correlations. So carry on.
That's okay. Identifying correlations can generate important hypotheses among other things. The problem is how the results were described. In a third of the studies, the medical journal articles themselves suggested that causation is in the absence of adequate evidence.
So just pause there for a second. So that's also pretty shocking, right? That 1/3 of and remember, this is not just any studies. 1/3 of the 50 most circulated studies on social media, which is where like a large chunk of people get their information from. 1/3 of the studies were actually flawed. That they suggested causation in the absence of adequate evidence, which should be scary and it should be a kind of cautionary tale for the kind of account of science I was trying to give you in the last few weeks, because the peer-reviewed journals are kind of the gold standard, supposed to be the gold standard for scientific research, but in actual practice, there may be many reasons why peer review fails. Okay, so carry on.
Matters got worse in the popular press. Nearly half of the news articles describing the studies made unwarranted claims about the causation. When reading articles about medical trials or any other studies that purport to demonstrate causality, you cannot count on the story being presented correctly. You need to be able to see through the bullshit.
So just pause there. Again, remember the kind of thing, if you open a newspaper, order this, a lot of stuff on nutrition science that's you're going to find. Eat eggs to reduce cholesterol, which is bad for your heart, or eat methi because it'll help reduce blood sugar. Do you come across this kind of statement? How many of you have come across that kind of statement, and how do you know somebody who's trying to act on the basis of similar kinds of like health advisories you read in the newspapers or on social media?
Sir, I have actually encountered these things, but maybe it's like that people do not easily, at least the people I know, do not easily believe on the social media tips and tricks that they give, but they easily fall for the tips that or the things that are given in newspapers. So
what's an example of that?
For example, the things you were mentioning, for example, methi is good for blood pressure or something like that, these things, or maybe you have this and you'll have a good height. Maybe these things were recommended in my childhood to me ki achhi height karni hai to have this and stuff like that I remember.
Okay. Sujit, you raised your hand.
Yes, sir. My dad does this a lot. Whenever he reads or views any YouTube video or read something on WhatsApp, he just he will ask, he will do that, and he will also ask us to do that. I mean,
Yeah, that's what.
yeah, at his age, in late 40s, there are a lot of some diseases that cause due to aging. So he uses all the, I mean, the techniques that are asked to do in that videos or forwards.
Okay, so we already, the last 2 times I taught this class, I'd had somebody come and give a guest lecture on essentially fact checking and stuff like that. So there's lots of dodgy places one can get one's information, but the sort of surprising sort of, well, maybe not that surprising lesson of this passage is that even the non-dodgy stuff, right? These are research studies published in medical journals. They are themselves problematic. So it's not the. Ravish has this thing, no, WhatsApp University. So it doesn't have to be on WhatsApp University to be problematic. It could be published in a very good journal with peer review. In fact, the journal article itself may be fine, but when it's filtered into the consciousness of kind of non-professionals through the media, then it may become a problem. There's another point where they make this point rather nicely. Let me see, it should be on. No, not there. Page 64. Sorry about this. 56 plus 64. That's right. I'm sorry. Oh yeah. So what we just saw was an account of how easy it is or how common it is for these confusions between correlation and causality to be presented, and again, often in perhaps completely innocent sorts of ways. Another kind of interesting and a nice kind of point that they make is that one should be quite attentive to language. So again, a researcher might be very scrupulous in saying that no, this data only shows correlation, it doesn't show causation. But nevertheless, in the way they talk about it, quite unconsciously, they may suggest causal connections, when they don't actually exist. So, Karthika, maybe you can continue reading from here. There are many ways to imply causality.
There are many ways to imply causality. Some are overt, smoking cancer causes cancer, or red wine prevents heart disease. Some make prescriptions to avoid cancer exercise 3 times a week, but others are less obvious. We can even imply causality with subtle grammatical shifts. We might express a correlation with a plain factual statement in an indicative mood. If she is a Canadian, she is more likely to be a bilingual. We express causation using a counterfactual statement in a subjective mood. Subjective mode. If she were a Canadian, she would be more likely to be a bilingual. The former statement simply suggests an association. The later statement suggests that being Canadian causes bilinguality. The former statement suggests that people are selected at random from a large group and their attributes compared. If the person we happen to pick is a Canadian, the second suggests that we pick someone and then change some of that person's characteristics if the person we picked were turned into a Canadian. It is subtle, but the subjunctive mood sneaks in a suggestion of the causality. Where minimum wage is higher, poverty is lower, is not the same claim as if the minimum wages were to increase, the poverty would decrease. The first reports a trend across cities. Those with higher minimum wage have lower poverty rates. The second suggests how one might go about reducing poverty in a particular city.
Okay, so this point, do you get the point being made there, that why it is, oh, you forget about why it is, about whether, do you agree that these two phrases don't make the same claim, or that the second phrase carries a kind of suggestion of causality and the former doesn't?
I guess I do agree on that. Means the first one just shows just more like gives the results of a data study, and second one is claiming that the minimum wages are inversely related to poverty.
And I think if minimum wages were to increase, it sounds sort of, look, if there was this intervention, then this would turn into something else.
Yeah.
Or some other change would happen in the world.
Yeah. Means the first one is just stating this association exists.
Right. This is the way the world is. And the second one is saying, if we were to change the world in a certain way, this is what we'd find.
Yeah.
And that suggests that, well, the reason we'd find this change is because there's a causal connection. So, maybe if you read newspaper articles or watch TV or whatever, maybe to pay attention to even this language shift. They also point out that, and this is actually a really fun thing to look at, data graphics and how they can be misleading, intentionally or not. The book also talks more about it, but they point out that sometimes it's a kind of convention that when you have a plot, let me just find this graph. So this is a graph where the x-axis is a change in housing price. I'm not sure what is the time period, and the y-axis is a change in fertility rate. And there's a debate. We'll look at the example in a bit more detail. The question was, okay, you see this, there seems to be some kind of correlation, right? You could draw a line sloping downwards towards the right, which suggests that as you change housing price, as housing becomes more expensive, fertility rate is declining. And they suggest, I don't know if you have this experience, that almost as a conventional matter, variables listed on an x-axis tend to be the, I guess what we call, the independent variable whose change determines that of the dependent variable. Now, I don't know whether that's your experience. I guess I feel like maybe I don't read graphs closely enough to even make that kind of jump. So yes, that's two kinds of takeaways. One is like, okay, look, what's the landscape, or what pitfalls might they be in the landscape of presentation about data on correlation, and in particular, could it be, that language itself is language or data presentation can mislead one to attribute causation when none has been found. And if you were to ask, okay, look, what is the takeaway for my critical thinking toolkit? One takeaway might just be to keep asking your question. Look, if you see a statement, is it in fact asserting causality, or is it just a kind of sloppy writing that suggests causality when the intention is to communicate only correlation? And then you can ask, in practice, one's really going to actually do this, right? Look, but what about the other? What about the original study? Did it actually look at correlation, look at causality, or only at correlation? And by the way, this, when I say only at correlation, or even when the authors say that, that's not to diminish correlation, right? Like we learn a lot about the world from knowing about correlations. So it's not like it's like a lesser form of knowledge. It lacks this kind of. It's always nice to have evidence of causality, but the point is not to dismiss studies which show evidence of correlation. It's just to say don't read into those studies more than their results actually warrant. Right? So that's the maybe two elements of the toolkit. A third element of the toolkit is this way they have of where's it gone? Of modeling causation and its connection with correlation or association. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and get a glass of water and switch off my audio and video. And what I invite you to do is just to take a quick look at that material and think about it, and we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so I'm back having had my drink of water. Let's go back to this. So you remember the study, right? This is association between positive self-esteem and having been kissed. And it might sound like, hey, raises people's self-esteem. So kissing is the cause of, you have this association. The reason people have high self-esteem is that they've been kissed, or which is the way the authors prevent the study, is that people get kissed because they have high self-esteem. I'm just going to bring you back to the beginning of the chapter that suggests that. Sorry, I have to. Here. What factors influence whether or not someone has been kissed? Positive self-esteem is amongst the best predictors, and it's self-confidence that is, the key reason why people in, I mean, this is a very American context, but may not be true in the Indian context. That it's self-confidence is the cause of people being kissed more often, right? That's the causal claim that the article seems to be making, or one way of reading that causal that claim. And these guys are skeptical about that. And what they want to do is find a framework where it's easy to disentangle the different kinds of causal claims. Let's get back to right. So you have initially, if you're not making a causal claim, you have the dotted arrow that shows the association, and then there are a bunch of different ways in which the causation well, that association might be modeled, right? You might think it's, as I just said, that it's the self-esteem, it's the having of the self-esteem that causes people to be attracted to you and therefore to want to kiss or be kissed by you. And these are what they call probabilistic causes, right? This claim doesn't say that, look, this is it's always going to be that if people who have self-esteem get kissed, but it's just more likely the higher one's self-esteem, the more likely one is to engage in kissing. And then one might want to, and there could be multiple mechanisms that explicate this sort of causal chain, right? You might think, look, this is why self-esteem leads you to pick a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and it's the fact that high self-esteem gets you to be in romantic relationships that is responsible for the association between high self-esteem and having been kissed. That's one kind of frame. And then there's the alternative. You might think that the reason people have high self-esteem is that they've been kissed. That's what this this arrow suggests, which is a kind of maybe an odd sort of claim to model, which is why they move on to suggest that perhaps both self-esteem and kissing are the result of, well, a common cause, right? And you can see here that one sort of model might be that if you're in a romantic relationship, well, there's both a greater likelihood of being kissed and also a greater likelihood of having more self-esteem. So there's no direct causal connection between these two variables, but they are both the result of some kind of more general background cause. Right, it might be that the a drop in alcohol consumption after the alcohol ban is correlated with a drop of crime rate, but that need not be because the alcohol consumption, the decline of alcohol consumption has caused the decline in crime rate. So you could perhaps you could draw that causal connection. It might just be that at the same time as implementing an alcohol ban, there's been an increased police presence in places with high crime rates. And maybe the common cause there is, I don't know, a new government in power which has made these promises to the electorate before the elections, something of that sort. And then there's also the possibility that you have causal feedbacks. Being in a romantic relationship, having been in a romantic relationship increases your self-esteem, and hey, having high self-esteem increases the chances of being in a romantic relationship, and therefore there's a kind of indirect causal connection with kissing. The point of doing all these different diagrams is to say all of these things are consistent with just data on associations. Right? These are kind of radically different hypotheses to how these variables are connected, but they're all equally consistent with the same data on association, even if the associations are quite strong. Let me pause there and ask any questions or comments on the material we've covered so far. any of it surprising to you, or pretty obvious stuff that you guys do in any case? No? Anything new? No, nothing. Okay. Then let's move on to do two things and ask, you know, what the takeaway might be for part of your critical thinking toolkit. Let's look at a real life example where, I mean, this is also a real life example, but this is a more significant kind of example that they use as a case study, and that's the case of what's known as the marshmallow test. Here. You guys come across this?
Yes, sir.
So why don't you describe, and what's the marshmallow?
A marshmallow is like a sweet, like.
Yeah, it's like a soft, sticky. I don't even know what they're made of, but they're soft, sticky, and gooey. Okay, Aditya, why don't you describe the marshmallow test and also tell us what's the context in which you've come across it?
So it is essentially about delayed gratification. So essentially, the experimenter puts the child in a room and there's a marshmallow on a plate, and then tells them if they wait for 5 or 10 minutes, then the experimenter will come back and give them 2 marshmallows.
Okay, so either they can have it now, or if they wait, they'll get more.
Yes, and then they leave the room, and then the experiment is essentially about what sort of people tend to wait. And it purported to show that the people who waited had better life outcomes.
Thought is they have better self-control or something like that, and you can, they're the kind of people who will, like, study for their JEE examination rather than watch TV, right? And the kind of people who will. What are other benefits of delayed gratification supposed to be? They're the kind of people who will go to the gym and work out, and therefore join the cricket team rather than sit at home and watch TV. And this nice test can show sort of which those people are, and people who quote unquote do well in the marshmallow test will just do better in life because they're able to, it's like the ant and the grasshopper story, right? That's essentially the marshmallow test is supposed to test for the ants. Yeah, Sujit, you had raised your hands.
Yeah, I typed in the chat box that with the waiting, we can also have control on our.
I'm listening to your voice. I don't know, is it my end or is it a general? I don't quite get what you're saying.
Is it clear?
Yeah, I can't. Are other people able to hear Sujit? Okay, I'm not sure Sujit, that you can hear me, so I'll just say I can't. Okay. So maybe the problem is Aditya or Karthik or Nish, can you hear Sujit?
No, sir, I can't hear Sujit. I don't think he's. I think he's.
He's trying to speak. So Sujit, I think the issue is at your end then. Yeah.
I'm audible now.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the problem is at my end. Actually, I was saying that with waiting, we can also have control on our emotional impulses.
That's right. So this is part of that theoretical package. It's a nice story, right? It's quite plausible, and it shows, again, these are US studies, right? That people do, people who do well in the marshmallow test, that is, people who are able to delay their gratification at the age of 4, at the age of 16 will do better in school. And one of the points the authors make is that the original study just said, look, here's this interesting correlation. I'm sure they drew some hypothesis, but again, they would say that the correlation by itself can't establish that hypothesis. And again, one of the problems is that the way media picked it up was that these studies were used as evidence to say that there's a causal connection. Delaying gratification causes success. Yeah, and therefore, if you want to be successful, why don't you go ahead and try and get yourself to learn how to delay your gratification, right? So here's the prescription. Now you should start building this skill of delayed gratification. And now I've not looked at this research work, but it's quite interesting, right? That this extremely popular psychological study. First of all, when people try to replicate, and this is a problem for psychology studies, that often they're not that easy to replicate. First of all, the researchers didn't find the original effect to be so strong, but they found that there's a possibly another variable, the socioeconomic status of the children in question was also highly correlated with both their ability on the marshmallow test and their scores in high school. Yeah, Aditya.
So this was more about psychology in general, but I was like, this is a very hypothetical answer. Like, I was suspecting that psychology has anti-inductive elements, because whenever there's a famous experiment, everybody starts to know about it, right?
Huh.
And that would change if you do the experiment. What would happen in the experiment if you do it again?
I see. So you think, but look, for that unless it be true for 4-year-olds, right? Like, I think what you're saying is, once the results of the experiment are known, then people who are going to, be in the experiments again are going to like change their behavior in the light of what they know.
Even if
right?
they don't even if they particularly do not know about the experiment, because of this experiment, delayed gratification became a big thing, and everybody has heard of that, and that generally changes how people act.
Right.
So I think that is why there is such a big problem in psychology, particularly about replication.
Right.
Because the psychology of people itself changes based on what experiments you do.
The replication crisis. There's a lot of
yes, sir.
Very famous studies, and this kind of deep stuff, right? This famous studies on how the mind works, claims about how the mind works, maybe are less robust than they were taken to be, because it's quite hard to replicate them. I was just saying that, look, in the case of the marshmallow test, maybe that's not true, because the 4-year-olds haven't heard of delayed gratification.
But I'm saying that generally the culture changes, right?
Yeah.
How it changes how the people would have treated the 4-year-olds, and there's a sort of basic culture which changes a lot because of things which get extremely famous, right?
Right.
And I'm saying that that sort of has an anti-inductive effect because it changes how people would have otherwise reacted.
Fair enough. I mean, I guess you'd have to just look in the particular case whether the change is one that would have, more likely to kind of verify the hypothesis or to go against it. But it's a fair point that perfect replication may not be possible because there are these background conditions. Like once the study's been done once, then you can't replicate the scenario in which that study has not been done.
Yes,
So next time you do it, the world has changed in this kind of irrevocable way. That's one way of putting your point.
that is
Sorry?
Yes, that's the point.
Yeah. Anyway, so the point that these guys make in this case is, well, look, there's this. You have one association, which is they don't have this, but basically an arrow from this ability to delay gratification to success in high school, and then now they're presenting another causal claim where there's a common cause between these two variables, and whenever you have a common cause, that common cause, you're going to have an association, right? And then you always have a mechanism again, as part of your toolkit. It's a useful thing to ask when you are given some kind of association and then explicitly or implicitly given some kind of causal takeaway, to ask yourself, look, what might the mechanism be that explains why one of these things causes the other, and that would be anyway the highlight of good scientific practice in this domain. And one of the points that they want to make, which we'll see in Kahneman as well, is, look, we as human beings, we see patterns, and our pattern seeking mechanisms are an important way of, I guess, success as a species. And so we often use these rules of thumb. If two things are associated, the one that happens first causes the one that happens second. So droughts and wildfires, but there are many things. There are many associations which are different in points of time where there's no connection at all. So there's no connection between migrating geese and returning to a river and salmon returning to a river, except that both at the same time of the year. There may be some common cause that explains both of those things, but no causal connection at all between the return of the geese and the return of the salmon. It's not like the geese are calling out to the salmon and then the salmon are coming. So there are maybe again as part of your toolkit a couple of takeaways. One is, when you're faced with a causal claim, just like, well, two things. One is when you're faced with a correlation or an association, generate multiple hypotheses, get into the habit of generating alternatives which have, essentially different causal pathways that would explain the same association. It's the kind of thing, if you take some economics courses or you take some psychology courses, this, I think, sort of becomes second nature. So that's one habit to get into. And the other habit is a useful heuristic is when you're presented causal claims, ask yourself, are there some common causes that might explain the association which is the basis of the causal claim at issue? So that's maybe another useful habit to have. So there are a couple of other things they do in this chapter. I don't want to go into it in much detail. There is the last section. They look at this example of the connection between taking fever-reducing medication and getting better, and surprisingly, maybe they find that there's a correlation between. So to put in causal language, which may be unjustified, taking fever medication is a bad idea because it's going to reduce your chance of recovery. But there is an association between, there you go. Between taking a medication, between having an association between having a fever and having a recovering from a disease. And then we get the same kind of question: is your recovery time better if you have a fever, or is it that people who are in a decent condition are those who both, their body is able to get have a fever, but it's the fact that they have a good condition that leads to their better outcome. And so they have a discussion. Look, how would you present it with these alternative causal hypotheses to explain the same association? What can you do? Well, you can run experiments. You can manipulate the world. So they do this thing of, they put these animals, they make the animals physically cold, and the effect of making them physically cold is actually to reduce their recovery time. And so they think, look, this is what's happening. It's it is the fever that's making a difference, because and the fever is making a difference because for whatever reason it's raising body temperature. And how do you tell? Because if you reduce the body temperature in other sorts of ways, you get the same kind of result. So intervention manipulation is one way of checking for causal connections. There's somebody whom you may have heard of. Is a computer scientist called Julia Pearl. Have you come across that name? He has a book, which I also used for teaching this at some point. Yeah, it's called The Book of Why, and a lot of that work has to do with really, entirely this question: how to differentiate causation from correlation. So I haven't read the book, but maybe the next time I teach this course, by that time I will have read it and assigned bits from it. So the last thing maybe I'll just discuss, and then we'll pause and take some Q&A, is they have this nice section on spurious correlations. So you have this very, very strong correlation between the age of Miss America in a particular year and the number of murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. So I didn't know you could have a murder by steam. How would you murder somebody by steam? It seems like burning them alive. I don't know. And I guess you don't burn them alive. You burn them till they're dead. Yes, Sujit.
Maybe giving insufficient oxygen, just providing the steam.
Yeah, maybe. So it's a kind of suffocation. But the point is that it looks so good, right? It's an 8-year period, and they say, look, this is not true when you extend the timeline. And the point they want to make is you're going to expect, if you look at enough data sets, you're going to find some cases where just by chance you'll find this correlation between two variables, and this becomes sometimes people refer to this practice as they use the term data dredging, but I've also seen the term data mining as kind of pejorative, critical term for this kind of practice. And they have a nice analysis of this. Look at this. The number of sociology doctorates awarded correlated with deaths caused by anticoagulants. So I guess an anticoagulant is something like aspirin, right? Makes it hard for your blood to clot. So I suppose if you're taking anticoagulants, then if you have an injury, you may die because lead to death. And they have a nice frame. Why don't we have somebody read out these three paras, and then we'll call it a day. Anyone who's not read before? Actually, only one person, right? Who's Arnesh, I think, hasn't read before.
Yes, sure, I'll volunteer.
Yeah.
From the first paragraph, right? You look at these. Okay. You look at these two trends and think, wow, what are the chances they would line up that well? 1 in 100. 1 in 1,000. That must mean something. Well, sort of it. It means that Vegan had to look through 100 or even 1,000 other comparisons before he found out that matched so well by chance. It doesn't mean that there is any meaningful connection between the two trends. It certainly doesn't mean that sociology grads are doing around with rat poison and killing people. In Vegan's case, this is just funny, but his mining for silly correlations parallels a serious problem that can arise in scientific analysis, particularly in the early extrapolatory stages. Much of science involves a search for patterns in nature. As larger and larger data sets become available with information about more and more variables, the search for patterns can start to look more and more like Vegan's humorous dragnating expedition. Researchers have collected a large survey data sets in which participants are asked dozens of questions about many aspects of their lives, values, personality traits, etc. While digging through these data sets to test hypotheses, researchers need to be careful that they are inadvertently doing what Vegan does on purpose, making so many different comparisons that they end up finding similarities that exist by chance rather than as a reflection of real world relationship.
Okay, so you just stop there. And let me just leave it open for a last round of questions, comments, and otherwise we can close. No, nothing interesting. Can you think of examples that you've come across on this kind of thing? Any of the stuff that's discussed in the chapter? Nope. Okay, well then, let me stop here. We'll carry on the reading on Monday. We'll look at the next chapter on Monday. See you then. Have a good Sunday. Thank you.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I had a general doubt regarding the grading in this course. So you had put up a message today regarding, I guess it was today only, regarding that question number 3 and 4 short answers are being considered as minors. So how is the grading actually changing? I wasn't sure.
It's not changing. Nothing in the grading is changing. This is just in the context of the your what's it called? Audit withdrawal decisions, which you have to make now by Monday. And there's a thought that, look, you need to have your minor answers. You need to know more about how well you've done in the course before you make that decision. So I was just telling you that for our purposes, the information you'll have available to you in order to make the decision is going to be those 4 things, like your marks in the first 4 short answers, and I have like just a few of the number 4 left to grade. I'll do that tonight. So there's that. I'll put up the answer key to the first assignment, and finally I'll put up the next 2 short answer questions. And people who want to take a call on whether to audit the course or not will have to do so on the basis of that information. But nothing substantively changes.
Got it. Thank you.
I'm not reweighting anything. Make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay then. See you guys. Bye.